and welcome back to my channel. We're starting off week 2 of my August vlog. Technically I'm filming this on Sunday, but I'm going to be talking about the books that I've read since Thursday. Most of these vlogs are going to go Thursday to Thursday. I am going to start this off by talking about a book that I should have DNF'd. I really should have. It's Fablehaven, book 5. This book took far too long to get through. It is exceptionally long and completely ridiculous. I think that most of the issues that I discovered in here had to have been present in the previous books, and I don't know why I didn't notice them. So first off, there are so many characters. There are way too many characters. Cannot keep hardly any of them straight. That's not a problem of the first book, because the first book is very limited to Kendra and Seth, the two main characters, going to Fablehaven, meeting their grandparents, and figuring out that there's this whole world of fantastical creatures. So that's very limited. There's the two kids, the grandparents, and then some of the fantastical creatures. Book 2 starts to bring in other people. They have been double-crossed so many times by so many different people that there's a scene at the beginning of this where they're traveling somewhere else because they're trying to keep the bad guy from getting a hold of something that's going to open this demon prison. They're riding along in a car, in 2 cars, I think, in Australia. Then they get to the house. Somebody else opens up the door, another one of the caretakers, and stabs one of the people that had been helping them, and then has them subdue the other guy because he's being controlled. And then they all just jump in the car with this woman, and somehow we can trust her. Where's the logic in that? There is none. I just went, what? And so many times the villain monologue comes in. One of the villains is the Sphinx. There's this time where he's having a conversation with Seth, which, let's address the point that Seth, as a 12-year-old, acts like he's a fully grown man with those kinds of logic. He's having a conversation with him and revealing everything to him, telling him the backstory of his life. Was that important to understand some of his motivations? Yes. Did it need to be forced at us? This overwhelming gush of information? No. That happens so many times in here. That's why it's so bloated. There's no need for this much. You can tell that I did not like this book. I actually will be unhauling books 2 through 4, and this one. I'm keeping the original on my classroom shelves because that was fine. And it's a decent length as well. I just was super stubborn when reading this book to have read the 5 books, well, the previous 4 books in the series. I really should have DNF'd this. I don't have anything else good to say about this. Then I'll mention one other book that I read via ebook. I don't have a physical copy of it. I need to, and that is volume 8 of Spy Family. Again, I loved it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the individual volumes as they go, but I just think that the way that this one was developed, because the family goes with the mom in this fake family, and she has to complete a job, but trying to hide it from her family, and they're on a cruise type thing. Really well done. So I definitely enjoyed that one and cannot wait to keep reading in the series. The 2 books that I finished via audiobook since Thursday, because obviously my audiobook time, listening time, is going down because, you know, I'm actively teaching. Can't listen during that. I didn't finish quite as many, and part of me is looking at this and thinking that there might have been more, but I don't think that there was. Obviously, in the next update, if I remember a book that I forgot about, because I try to, whenever I finish a book, just move it to a different section on that shelf that you see behind me when I'm over in the other location. So if I find another one, I'll talk about it in the next update. Anyway, I have 2 to talk about. The first of those is The Sun and the Star by Rick Riordan and Marco Chiru. This is Nico's story. I wish that Nico's story had been more connected to one of the overall plots in this world. This was a good book. I just almost wonder if it would have been better off being handled by just one author and not co-written, because it felt a bit lost at times. There was a lot of reminiscing in here about all the different things that Nico has gone through in his life in this series. But it definitely read very differently than all of the other Percy Jackson books. And Nico is a character in those stories. I think that's what felt a little weird to me. There also were some plays with the chronology of the storytelling. And part of that was a conceit of the big bad guy in this book. But the other part of it was just the plain old storytelling. It weaved around multiple times in chronology. And there were also dreams that were bringing up the past, Nico's past. I prefer much more solid chronology. Even if you're gonna have flashbacks, that's totally fine. But for me, it needs to be more, sorry, I just knocked a book down. But for me, it just needs to be more confirmed. And I think also thinking of the target demographic for this, the upper middle grade, lower YA, a lot of those students are just starting to develop abstract thinking and starting to get into that. And so super complex chronology doesn't necessarily work as well. Overall though, I enjoyed the story. I really appreciate the way that Nico finally has his own book and gets his own story explored and told more. Is this my favorite out of the Percy Jackson world written by Rick Riordan? No. And also, I think a thing that doesn't help it is the timing of where this book sits in the overall chronology of the universe. Because you have this one taking place after the Trials of Apollo series, but before the Chalice of the Gods. So this first one where Percy needs to get recommendation letters to get in college, because Percy and Annabeth are in college in this book. So I think that also does it a bit of a disservice, because this was published before Chalice of the Gods. I don't know, it's just interesting the timing wise on this one. The book that I finished most recently is not the Inheritance Games, that's book 1, The Hawthorne Legacy by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. Is this absolutely stellar literature? No. Was it enjoyable? Yes. That's almost exactly what I felt about the Inheritance Games. And I thought that the way that Barnes kept the mystery going, tying off one piece in the first book in the trilogy, I think it worked really well. She did open up a possibility in this book that you thought was closed off and the answers were gotten in the first book. She's not doing a complete 180 on that and subverting and be like, oh, haha, you thought this, but it was actually this. She doesn't completely do that, but for a very large part of this story, you believe, and the main character Avery also believes, that something that was resolved in the first installment is actually different than what they originally thought. So I think this deepened the world. It showed a little bit more explanation of why Tobias Hawthorne chose Avery to inherit, but there's still some mysteries on that because of how the connection unfolded at the very end of the book. I will say, the reveal of who the quote-unquote bad guy for this particular installment was felt a little cheesy. However, I think that's the style of this sort of book. I also appreciated the fact that the love triangle between two of the brothers and Avery was tamped down. In my mind, I don't know. Is it possible for someone to feel some sort of romantic way towards two people at once? Yes. But I just don't get the feeling that Avery actually feels romantically for either one of these boys, which I find interesting. I will definitely be continuing on in the third book in this trilogy. The fact that Jennifer Lynn Barnes has written at least one and maybe plans more in this series, I'm like, how far can you actually stretch this? So unlike the Truly Devious series, I may leave this one at just the trilogy, but the completionist in me may want to keep going with everything. We shall see if she sticks the landing with the final gambit. I still need to get a hold of that. but that's a future me problem. The book that I started last night, read a bunch today, is Black Sun. I'm intrigued by that one, but I'm not as captivated as I would have hoped to be, and I'm not sure why. There are multiple perspectives in this book, and there are different narrators for each of these perspectives. I think part of the problem is the fact that the two male narrators are not very different from each other, and the two female narrators are not very different from each other, at least vocal quality. And so when I know the difference between male and female narrators, however, it takes some time once it switches over for me to be like, oh, it's this female character, not that female character, or vice versa. I think that's a little bit of it. And also, there's a few different timelines going on here. There's some that are, I believe, like 5-ish years in the past, and then some of the timelines are happening at the same time, but they seem to be in completely different areas. And I have yet to see how those are going to interact. And I also have yet to figure out what is the driving thing that is happening in this world, but I'm really intrigued by it. It doesn't seem high stakes, and yet it does, which seems like, what are you trying to say? I'm not really sure, but I am very intrigued by it. I'm going to try to devote at least enough time later today to finish that so that I can still stack my weekends with above the 300 some pages I need to read a day to reach my goal, because I'm definitely not getting as much read during the week as I had thought. That being said, now that I have finished Fablehaven, I'll be able to use my physical, aka non-audiobook reading time for some of my arcs. I'm much more excited about that. Okay, I'm back to make the second and final clip of this recent reads vlog-ish. This is going to be the thing for during the school year. I was going to say that there's not enough time. Technically, there probably is. However, the motivation when I come home at the end of the day, that's the thing I lack. However, I'm going to get this filmed, wrapped up. It is Wednesday, so it is the end of week 2. I have continued to read quite a lot of books. There are 3 up there. I have 3 here, and then I have 1 that I do not have a physical copy of because I had it as an ARC. Speaking of which, I am going to talk about that one first so I don't forget. But that is the one that I finished most recently. I finished it this morning. It's called The Liar's Test, and I apologize, I do not know how to pronounce this author's name, nor do I remember it at the moment. At the start of this book, I was both intrigued and confused. So it opens in media res, so in the middle of things is what that term means. And lots of books that I've read before, they do that. And it's fine, because after opening up in the middle of things, the author either takes a step back, gives you a bigger picture, or somehow explains what's going on as you're going through the novel. This author did not do that. She drops us into the story, and we just take off. There's almost no world building in this. And for someone like me, who's read a lot of fantasy, I don't know necessarily that I have paid close attention to the world building, but I can definitely tell the lack of it. And this book lacked it significantly. I don't even understand it enough to give you an explanation. You have a character. This character is mourning someone who she calls Blue, but then later on, there's somehow someone else and someone very old, which I was very confused by because this person is also somewhat of a love interest. She is part of a group known as the Tree Singers. Apparently, this society is divided into groups. Those groups are never defined. They're mentioned. They're never defined, however. And of course, ranking-wise, the Tree Singers are at the bottom. 4 years prior, there's some horrible sickness that took out everybody except for her. But somehow, a family member comes in later. I don't understand that one. There are a lot of things that I don't understand about this. Then we discover that being queen is a result of a contest. We don't know how often this contest happens. It just so happens to occur right then, basically at the start of the story. Tree Singers are usually not invited to participate, but they are this time And of course, our main character is selected to be the tree singer's candidate for this. And there's some sort of ancient lore about, I don't even remember the rhyme, but it's almost guaranteed that every single time at least 2 people will die. No, exactly 2 people will die. 2 people will be in this unending sleep. And then of the 3 left over, all of the groups vote and that person becomes queen. It just so happens to happen here. And the tests themselves are so strange. I don't understand them at all. Another thing about a main character is she's a memory walker. So she will often go into people's memory. There is no transition whatsoever. And so all of a sudden you go from first person in this character's head to another first person, but it's whoever's memory she's in. But she doesn't know before going into the memory whose memory you're in. So you go from her, you know who she is. You go into this other memory, you've got first person, but you don't know who it is right away. Very confusing. And then we get to the end, things happen, there's an ending. Even with all the confusion, some of the ending was still predictable. So needless to say, I did not like this book. Let's move on to some that I did enjoy, because I really enjoyed all the other 3 that I have to talk about. So I'll start with Black Sun. This was one of my series to start. I'm very ahead on that goal. I don't remember whether I talked about this in last week's video or in the first clip. Whenever I talked about it, I had gotten about halfway. Obviously, I have now finished it. The way that Rebecca Roanhorse brings together all of those perspectives at the end, chef's kiss. So well done. Today, I was reviewing plot structure with my students, and I talked about the types of books that are cliffhangers, and was trying to get them to guess at what point on the plot structure that was. I just remembered when thinking about this book. This book definitely has the type of plot structure that you think would not work, where you have the exposition, you have rising action for the majority of this book, and you're leading towards this climax, where you get towards the climax with enough time for it to be resolved somewhat. You know there's going to be more in this series. There's no falling action or resolution in this book. It is a legit cliffhanger. You get to the point where you know chaos is unfolding in front of everybody. Book ends. Now I'm going to set my expectations realistically, because from everything that I've heard, there were a lot of people really into this, and I get that with the raised expectations for the cliffhanger, if you don't do it well enough in the second book, people are going to be disappointed with the second book. And I've heard a lot of disappointment expressed in reviews. However, I really enjoyed this. This was quite a unique storytelling manner, I should say. This next book is a reread, and I do not do that often. I used to do it a lot more. There were times where I read through my entire owned TBR, but basically my entire library to see if I was going to keep books. And this was back when I had a ton of Christian fiction books, and gradually we did a bunch of books out of there. But since that point, I don't reread a lot. There's so many books that I want to read. I don't have time for it. That book is The Raven Boys. I knew this would be a reread. I wanted to do it intentionally because I had only vague memories of this book. This is a series that I started prior to BookTube. I read this in 2019. I want to clear off all those series from my list. So I was like, okay, I'm not going to do that a disservice and not read the first book first. And this also fits on my Our Fantasy bingo for one of the prompts. So I decided to look and find that old review. And I said, this wasn't the book for me. I enjoyed it. I saw a lot of great things in it, but I didn't like how she drops you into the action and you just take going. So speaking of In Media Res, I did not see that coming into this on the reread. I didn't look up my previous review until I had already gotten into the book. When I dropped into this book, and when I started reading this book, immediately it captured my attention. The atmosphere, Maggie Stiefvater captures atmosphere so well in this book, and she balances all the perspectives incredibly well. I loved it. I don't know what I was thinking back then. I was like, oh, this was good. It's just not the book for me, so I'm not going to be continuing in the series. Now I can't wait to read the rest of the books in the series. This was a very high 4.5 stars for me. There were still some slight inconsistencies that dropped it down just a little bit for me, but not all that much. I think this was just so much fun to read. It's haunting. It's not typical fantasy. A lot of people categorize it as fantasy. In my logs, I put paranormal, but it's one of those that doesn't fit a particular genre. I'm so excited to keep going in this series. The last book that I read was a memoir, The Girl with Seven Names. I'll put this on my TBR. Back when I first started watching BookTube, the first BookTuber I started watching was Murphy Napier, and she read this around this time, rated it 5 stars, so I knew I wanted to read it. Now, I'm not going to be rating it 5 stars, not because it wasn't good, but because I don't write memoirs. I really struggle with rating them. This was so fascinating. This is a perspective that is so rarely heard. A defector from North Korea. And she takes such care in the telling of her story in her growing up years, her relationship with her parents, especially her relationship with her father, who was not her biological father, but she found that out later. And she talks about how she treated him. And it wasn't his fault, but there's parts of that culture that place such value on bloodlines. She was buying into that culture. And her deconstruction from all the indoctrination drilled into her entire life in North Korea was fascinating and heartbreaking. And especially towards the end when she's talking with her mother. I was going to say, I don't want to give it away. It's her life. It's very well written. And I'm so glad that I read it. I have to admit, my August rating might be a little bit lower than I would like because of a couple of books, because of Fablehaven Book 5 and because of The Liar's Test, or just Liar's Test, no the in front of it. But other than that, I've been reading some really good books. Not quite 5 stars. That's another reason why my rating might be lower, but we shall see what the second half of the month holds. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.